Evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me on a Saturday night. It's a real pleasure to be speaking, Romancing the Gothic again. And today I'm going to be talking about a hellhole in Derbyshire. You may be forgiven for asking which one, but I'm not going to be covering anything about Alfreton or Belper today. And I'm not going to be talking about House of Holes, which is an over 18s crazy golf venue in Derby. As tempting as it is to talk about that, and interesting as it looks as a venue. No, I'm going to be talking about a hellhole, entrance to hell, that is situated in a very quiet and isolated Derbyshire village in the High Peak called Peak Forest. And it's a very tiny place that my parents moved to quite a few years ago now. A little bit like Royston Vasey, but not quite as metropolitan. Did have a general store, but due to lack of custom, it closed down. People make all kinds of strange scarecrows. And if you walk up Eldon Hill towards the top of the village, you'll find all sorts of sights that are very reminiscent of folk horror. So if you don't want to see a dead sheep, please look away now for the next few seconds. This is a dead sheep I found on Eldon Hill. It's actually green and rotting and almost zombified with these strange mushroom-like prongs of spine sticking out of it as well. So yeah, really gruesome sight to greet me as I made my way to Eldon Hole at the very summit of the hill. So Eldon Hole, historical spelling Elden, modern spelling with an On, um, is a natural pothole. It is Derbyshire's deepest natural pothole, situated on Eldon Hill, just above Peak Forest. It's about 100 feet long and 20 feet wide, although you can't see all of it very clearly because it's covered with trees and nettles and ferns. It was believed to be bottomless until the 18th century, so this is where the kind of fame of Eldon Hole comes from. People thought that it didn't have a bottom and that it connected to the underworld, to hell specifically. But in 1770, a man called John Lloyd busted the myth of the bottomless pit, and he actually made a descent into it and drew a diagram, which I'll show you in a minute, which shows that it's not actually bottomless. It is, in fact, around 245 feet deep, although there is a lower chamber, which adds another 70 feet of depth to it as well. People routinely started descending after John Lloyd had busted that myth, and continued to do so until about 1810. And after that, people lost interest. Eldon Hall became no longer a site of wonder and curiosity for people. It just sort of fell off the cultural map. I'm hoping for a mini revival of Eldon Hall as a result of this talk. So here are some diagrams of the inside of the cave. So we've got a shaft going down in both of these diagrams, but in the 1771 from John Lloyd, but in a later one as well, in an article by Ernest A. Baker. He went down in 1900, a few times, in fact. And it's a bit of a game of spot the difference. So you can see for John Lloyd, it's a much more detailed diagram of that chamber, looking a bit like a honeycomb. He's got diagrams of the different sorts of stalagmites and stalactites that you find there. And he's also got this lower shaft that leads down to a subterranean river. Whereas in Ernest Baker's diagram, all it has is that little bit of the first part of the chamber, and there's no indication that there's a lower shaft or a subterranean river there at all. Now, Ernest Baker had better equipment. He also went down several times. And John Lloyd has become a bit notorious for hoaxing or making up certain details of his account, or at the very least, just not questioning what people have told him. So Edward King wrote a letter in response to his account saying, "Oh, I heard from a miner's wife that there is this lower shaft that leads to this underground river." And he just took that, and it was reprinted with his account, but there's no great evidence to support it. So I think as as unimaginative as it may look, the second diagram is probably more accurate. But I'm not so much interested in what's really down Eldon Hole as what people thought was down Eldon Hole. So Daniel Defoe was quite a fan of the place. He thought it was a real wonder of the Peak District, and this is him being fairly dismissive of lots of other sites. So he really put it up there as a marvel of nature. But he says what nature meant in leaving this window open into the infernal world, if the place lies that way, we cannot tell. But it must be said, there is something of horror upon the very imagination when one does but look into it. So we can't objectively tell what's down there, he says, obviously writing before Lloyd's descent. But what we can be sure of is the effect it has on our thoughts and our feelings. And this is, where we're getting this passion of horror coming from. And it reminds me a little bit of the way Robert Macfarlane talks about the foiber in the Slovenian highlands. So in his book Underland, he discusses how one particular foiber, which was used to murder people during and after World War II, murder civilians and military personnel as part of the massacres perpetuated by the communist partisans of Yugoslavia. He says, we can't access what's actually down this sinkhole, which is notorious for having people thrown down it alive. But there are all kinds of contested ideas and theories and information to do with it. So he writes, because detailed scrutiny of the contents of this foiber is unfeasible, it has remained a void, susceptible to multiple projections of claim and belief. So I think Eldon Hole is pretty much like that as well. It's a site of great creativity. It inspires so many stories. They're stories of destruction. And I think the writers, through these stories, partly try to contain the threat of it. They try to make it a bit more understandable, but because it's a void and it can't thoroughly be known, and because it's an absence and can't be contained, you get more and more echoes of these stories that get, more grotesque and exaggerated as the centuries go on until they stop altogether. It reminds me a little bit of the way Margaret Keane describes hell. Hell is hard to control. This is because it has always been a shared narrative world. And Eldon Hole and the Peak District landscape is also a shared narrative world, which I'll be exploring today. So the structure of my talk goes like this. In part one, I'll be looking at the history of cracks in the earth and their association with hell, brief overview of that, and a short word about gender at the end of that too, and the gendering of the landscape and particularly hellholes. For part two, I'll go specifically on to Eldon Hole, its literary history in John Hobbes and Charles Cotton, but also some accounts that follow and precede those, and the folklore that surrounds it. And in the third part, I'm going to introduce a bit of creative writing. I've actually written a whole novel about Eldon Hole and Peak Forest. It's a historical folk horror novel. So I'll be reading a little bit of that just to show you how I've used some of this research, because all of this really started as research for that novel. So first off, where does the name Eldon come from? So in Alaric Hall's brilliantly titled article, Are There Elves, Any Elves in Anglo-Saxon Place Names? He says that Eldon Hill was first attested in 1285 as Elvedon, Elves Hill. We should be a bit wary of saying that elves were definitely on this hill, and that's what it was named after, because he says it could just come from the given name Alva, which is nowhere near as exciting but more plausible. He says there are only two unambiguous cases of place names that contain Alf, as in elf. So we have Alfrunge in Kent and Ilvingdene in Berkshire, Elvingdene. However, he does note that a lot of these places with Alf in their names are meadows, hills, valleys, places where you would expect to find the creature of an elf. And he does point to the 13th century South English legendary as containing some information about where elves like to hang out. And one of the places is Upper Hia Dun, as upon high hills. So perhaps there's a bit more to this connection between elf and the creature elf than you might initially think. And I think another interesting stream to consider is place names with hob in the name. So there's a lot of caves and hills with hob, including in Derbyshire, Hob House Cave in Monsaldale. And again, they are elf-like creatures. They can be helpful, but they can also be mischievous. And they were thought to hang out in hills and holes, cracks in the earth. Sarah Semple has done a much broader survey of these mythological folkloric creatures and where they might abide in the landscape. So she explores further connections between place names, possibly referring to supernatural entities like Drake and Grimm, and ancient earthworks such as ditches, barrows, and fissures. She concludes in her survey the preponderance of haunted nooks, hollows, fissures, pits, and watery places is compelling. All such places could have carried potency as imagined interfaces or access points to other supernatural worlds. So, think, for instance, of Guthlac, the saint who battled with demons in a haunted barrow in the Lincolnshire Fenland, kind of early Anglo-Saxon example of what she's talking about there. And she also finds that cracks in the earthen barrows carried specifically hellish connotations in later Anglo-Saxon culture. Of course, it goes further back than that. So we can look at Tartarus and this idea that Tartarus was a great gulf that was as far underneath the earth as the earth was from heaven. This was, of course, the gulf into which Zeus threw the Titans and imprisoned them. And in the Homeric hymns, we are given this very evocative picture that if you were within the gates, you would continue falling for a whole year until you reach the end, and you'd be carried this way and that by blasts of wind. It's kind of similar to, what we find later when we look at the fallen angels and how they were cast down into hell. Talking of the Bible or biblical stories or apocryphal stories, I guess, but nevertheless to do with religion. In the Bible, there are various references to pits. In Isaiah, it's not necessarily a hell pit. It mentions the realm of the dead being in the depths of the pit. But really, we're getting that connection with hell in Revelation, which is where, in which book God throws the beast into an abyss. And the abyss is described as being like a giant furnace, and the beast is locked and sealed in there for 1,000 years. So we see a lot of this sort of imagery coming into medieval depictions of hell pits. And they particularly liked to convey what the mouth of hell would have looked like in visions of the afterlife, of the other world, and in manuscripts. So we've got a brilliant one here from the Hours of Catherine of Cleves, which has these various different layers to it. So you've got one at the top, which seems to be leading to a furnace, and then cauldrons either side, which is a great little detail. And then the gate underneath is this, I want to say cat mouth, being held open by demons, which then leads to another cat mouth and a cauldron inside that. So while it's not like a vertical descent, you're descending further and further into the innermost chamber of the horrible stinking cat's breath. And there is something like, very disturbing about that image of the raw flesh on the inside as well. You kind of get that sense of heat and stink from it too. Going on into the early modern period, I want to just emphasize a connection that we start seeing a bit more of. So in Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, he genders the pit of hell. The pit of hell opened her mouth just where I stood. So there is that connection that is being made here between perhaps female deception and hell, or even female anatomy and hell. And we see that really clearly in King Lear. So in a misogynistic tirade against his daughters, Lear says that women cannot be trusted, and he particularly concentrates on the anatomy here. So he says, "But to the girdle do the gods inherit. Beneath is all the fiends. There's hell. there's darkness. There is the sulphurous pit, burning, scalding stench consumption. So it's a really misogynistic, evocative idea of a hell pit there being part of a woman's body. And I mention it because this does come up in Hobbes. So Hobbes wrote De Mirabilibus Pecci, The Wonders of the Peak. Um, he wrote it after his travels with the second Earl of Devonshire, William Cavendish, to whom he was acting as a tutor. And he wrote it up in Latin hexameter verse in 1636. Now, it wasn't too popular when it first came out. Really, it started to gain popularity after he wrote Leviathan and gained some notoriety for that in 1651. So we see it going through further editions throughout the later 17th century, with an English translation being made by a person of quality in 1678. And that's the edition I'll be using today. So, in The Wonders of the Peak, he records his experiences at a variety of miraculous places. So, you've got St. Anne's Well, which has healing waters, hot springs, Chatsworth House, obviously the house of his employer there. So he's making a big deal out of how amazing that is. The Devil's Arse, otherwise known as Peak Cavern, which is a cave system in Castleton. Mamtor, a shifting mountain. It's made of has shale, so it seems as though it's losing. It's having like these constant kind of land shifts, so it's called the Shivering Mountain actually. An ebbing and flowing well at Tideswell, which rises with the tide and drops when the tide goes out, apparently. Pool's Cavern, where a famous outlaw hung out, and Eldon Hole. So he describes Eldon Hole in quite a funny way. He introduces it to us with this description. First, the figure of its mouth let's take. Let the apt simile be but complete. To small things, so thou mayst compare what's great. Tell me, tell it to me alone, tell it to my ear, whisper it, that none but thou and I may hear. She's dumb, as conscious of the form obscene. Upon the side of a fair hill that's green, its rim descending with the mountains seen, driving off herds that graze around it far, and sucking, note the long S is sucking, with dark lungs the pliant air. So he's calling upon his muse to help him describe what the hole looks like, to come up with an apt simile. And the muse is too ashamed, you just cannot say it. But we're told at the bottom here, the mouth of the hole is of a gnunoid form, or like the privities of a woman. That's, of course, the translation in the Latin, est enim foveos forma cunoides. So we can guess what word that might relate to in modern English. He goes on to tell a folk tale about this. Once he's, oh, sorry, I'm skipping ahead of myself. I'll get to the folk tale in a minute. First of all, he throws a stone into the mouth of the hole to see how long it takes to reach the bottom. And in doing so, he describes how the stone descends through the infernal spheres. So first of all, the limbo of the patriarchs, otherwise known as the bosom of Abraham, where the patriarchs dwelt prior to Christ harrowing hell. He describes the empty seats there because they've all gone. Purgatory, the limbo of the unbaptized for children who've died with original sin still on their heads. And finally, Infanda Tartara, hell itself, where we find virtuous pagans on the top level. So he's sort of mixing here a little bit of inspiration from Dante with the virtuous pagans, but also drawing on writings of theologians, including Thomas Aquinas, in describing these infernal spheres that you get to before hell proper. And this, he describes it in quite a fearsome way. He evokes the horror of these different spheres quite well. And Jess Edwards, in writing about Thomas Hobbes and Charles Cotton's Wonders of the Peak, says that Hobbes and his companions experience a fear and distrust provoked by boundlessness, thrilling to an experience of raw, chaotic nature. Their response is to clutch at stony fortifications and to seek the reassuring bounds of scientific understanding. So she's very much arguing in that article that even as early as the Wonders of the Peak, we're seeing something of the Leviathan. So in Leviathan, Hobbes makes this philosophical, political argument that by nature, people want to protect themselves. We are all after self-preservation. And because we can't really tell what other people's motivations are, we're a bit worried they might hurt us. This leads to conflict and war. And if we were to pursue this natural state of being, then the life of man would be, very short and very nasty. So therefore, we need an authority. We need to kind of give up some of our rights in order to have an authority protecting us and looking after our welfare in the Commonwealth. So she sees this kind of idea of chaotic raw nature as something quite frightening for Hobbes, and he seeks the reassurance of these fortifications. But I would argue that he's not quite managed to pin down his fear and doubt, and it still lingers after this account of throwing a stone into the hole. He then goes on to talk about a folk tale in the area. So the peasant's descent is what I've called it here. He recounts a story that is told locally about Robert Dudley, who in the age of Elizabeth requested a peasant to be lowered down into the hole to test its depth for a petty price. This poor peasant had his rope tied around his middle and was hung in the middle of the cave. He was given a basket of stones to throw down so that listeners could tell how deep it went, and he was lowered 100 yards, but then he was drawn up. And when he was drawn up, he'd absolutely lost his mind. So Hobbes says, whether fear immoderate distracted him, or 'twere from the swift motions the rope might wreath, or spectrums from his fear, or hell beneath frightened the wretch, or his soul's citadel was stormed or taken by some imp of hell, for certain 'twas he raved. This his wild eyes and paleness and trembling, all things verifies. So there's a real doubt here, which perhaps comes from his understanding of physics. Hobbes was, in a way, he was quite a skeptic. He thought that we could only trust what was external to us insofar as we knew that something was causing motion, which then affected our passions and our perceptions, but we couldn't accurately tell what it was that was causing this motion in the first place. So he's got like lots of options here. It might be an imp of hell, or it might just be the motion of the rope, or it could be the fear itself. And you wouldn't really be able to tell, according to Hobbes' physics, whether it was something that springs from the mind or something that was actually external. So he's leaving open that window of doubt. He's not able to fully clutch onto his fortifications of certainty here. All he knows is this peasant was raving, and he says that within 8 days he died. Charles Cotton is very interested in this story and in lots of other things that Hobbes writes. In fact, in a time where plagiarism wasn't really considered an academic sin, he wrote his own Wonders of the Peak, which covers the same territory. He revisits the same wonders as Hobbes did. He also describes Eldon Hole as the mouth of hell and has this wonderful quote: "He that standing on the brink of hell can carry it so unconcerned and well as to betray no fear is certainly a better Christian or worse than I." So he's admitting to his own fear, but he's also, again, kind of leaving open this doubt. Can the person who stands on the brink align themselves with God because they have so much faith, or are they more aligned with the devil because that's what is down there? He adds to the lore of Eldon Hole by telling some lying and ridiculous tales. One is of a goose that is thrown down and comes out of the devil's arse, so Peak Cavern, a few miles down the road, shell naked, rifled of her plume, and sort of black and smoking, because this goose has walked through the fires of hell. There's perhaps a little bit of truth in that, because modern cavers have noted that if you put some dye down Eldon Hole, the dye comes out in Peak Cavern. So there may be this connection. There may even be a subterranean river, for all we know. It's not actually fully being confirmed. There's not the evidence there to support that yet, but they are certainly connected. He also tells of a bell being lowered down, and while the bell disappears, the rope comes up very quickly, and it is filled with curious knots made wondrous fine, as if by these sort of nimble fingers of whatever is living down in the hole. But he dismisses these tales as ridiculous. He has no respect for these. He does say, however, along with idle fables, there are some modern truths. So he retells the story of the peasant's descent. A mercenary fool exposed his life for gold to explore what lies enclosed in this obscure vacuity and tell of stranger sights than Theseus saw in hell. But the poor wretch paid for his thirst for gain, for being craned up with distempered brain and faltering tongue, and a wild staring look, whether by damps not known or horror struck. He then goes on to die pretty soon after that. So he's borrowing quite a lot of stuff there from Hobbes, again, leaving open that doubt about what it was that caused the peasant to lose his mind. Um, but he makes it a lot more about a fable against of greed. He's a mercenary fool. And note that Dudley isn't mentioned at all. There is perhaps some truth behind this folk tale as well. So if we look at an account from about 1600, we see something a bit more plausible. So this is reprinted, first of all in England described, and then also cited in T.R. Shaw, an article from 1965. So it runs like this: about 60 years since, so 1600. One Mr. Henry Cavendish, elder brother to Sir Charles Cavendish, who had spent all his days in travel and had been at Jerusalem and several other parts of the world, and hearing of Eldon Hole, came to it and caused engines to be made, or to let a man into the hole. This being done, one George Bradley of Peak Forest was let down in a rope 80 yards, so 80 yards. He then talks about how another engine of 80 yards was made, and a third engine. And at the top of the rope was fastened a bell, which he was to ring if he could go down no further or would return back. When he was let down almost the third 80 yards, he rung the bell, and being drawn up, he was much affrighted, remained speechless for a time, and was struck with lameness. But after he recovered his speech, he declared that as he descended down were bones of deer, sheep, and other cattle, and also of men, and that he was affrighted, but how and in what manner he could not tell. He lived several years, but never was in perfect memory, nor sound of his limbs. So we have lots of similarities to the accounts told by Hobbes and Cotton, but also some differences. So the fact that it was the Cavendishes who wanted to lower down this peasant and not Dudley perhaps seems more plausible given that the Cavendish family lived in the area. Hobbes worked for the Cavendish family, so he may not have wanted to implicate them in this. We're given a name, George Bradley, and Bradley is quite a common name around Peak Forest. We're also given some of these details of the bones of deer, sheep, and cattle, which of course were grazing on the land at the time. He also doesn't die 8 days later, but several years later, which again seems more plausible. But I love this as the kind of germ of a folk story that develops and is exaggerated as the years go on. We've also got reference to the bell there, so perhaps that's where Cotton got his idea of the bell and the rope, or where the villagers retold this story and it became a bit wilder. There is another story that Cotton tells, which is a particularly great one as well. So this is not mentioned in Hobbes. This is just mentioned in Cotton. He says that one night a stranger turned up at the village. Doesn't mention which one, but probably Peak Forest, and wishes to know the way to a certain town. A man and his accomplice decide to rob him. They say they'll lead him through the darkness to this town in question. One leads his horse, the other takes his hand, and with a show of care conducts him thus to these steep thresholds of black Erebus. And there, O act of horror which outvies the direst of human cruelties, let me, my muse, repeat it without sin. The barbarous villain pushed him headlong in. So, yeah, very kind of exaggerated appeals to his muse to help him retell this story, a little bit like Hobbes's gesture of like, oh, I can't possibly say what this hole looks like. But you've got this really intriguing story of these double murderers leading someone to the threshold of hell or night, almost as if they're kind of a bit psychopompic, but they're there to actually rob him. This actually comes from an earlier text, or at least a version of it is found in an earlier text, Edward Brown's tour in Derbyshire in 1662. Changed a little bit, So one wretched villain confessed upon a time at the gallows that he robbed a gentleman and threw him in Eldon Hole together with his horse. I don't know why he'd throw the horse and not just sell the horse, but maybe he didn't want any evidence. So we have one villain here, not two. But we have, again, some similarities to the actual story that Cotton tells. We can perhaps look for an origin even further back. So there are very scanty records of executions that happened at Derby prior to the early 18th century. However, in 1660, one John Crossland accepted the court's offer of pardon if he would hang his father and brother. Pretty gruesome. What were they guilty of? Horse theft. And Crossland is a name that you find a lot in Peak Forest. So perhaps, argues Roger Flindle, perhaps this is where we get the origin of the murderous thieves. Wherever it came from, however true it was, picked up by later writers and then exaggerated and amplified. So Daniel Defoe retold the story in his tour through the whole island of Great Britain, tells it pretty much as Cotton does, and he offers the comment, it's a story enough to make the blood run cold through the heart of those who hear it told, especially if they know the place too. So if you've got that experience of going to Eldon Hole, it's all the more disturbing for you because you can see like the depths of the pit into which this poor helpless victim was thrown. We also get similar stories perpetuated in the 19th century about horses wandering around without riders near Eldon Hole, which stoked speculation about robbers stealing goods and throwing their victims down the hole. However, there is no evidence that this actually happened. My favourite account or retelling of this story is in Jewett in Wanderings of Memory or Buxton and Peak from the early 19th century. And he really does say that this happens quite a lot. Here oft the murderer has his victim thrown. Here cattle oft have tumbled headlong down. And of the lone benighted traveller here has found his grave. No tongue to warn him near, no friendly taper shooting thwart the gloom, no hand to snatch him from his gory tomb. Too soon, alas, the plumbing gulf he finds and gives his death streak to the mountain winds. So it's a very evocative image that he's using from all these different accounts that have accumulated over the centuries. So I wanted to add my own voice to this tradition. And as I was saying at the beginning, I've been working for quite a few years on a manuscript called The Brink, and it's a historical folk horror novel set in 1642, so on the brink of the English Civil War as well. And it takes a lot of these strands from the history and folklore of Eldon Hall and kind of brings them together in what I hope is a cohesive way. So I've decided to gender the hole as female in The Brink. I liked the idea of it being a monstrous she, and it's a very female-led narrative, a very queer narrative, and so this kind of idea of the monstrous, devouring female appealed to me. I've also taken the strand of the descent of the peasants. So my story concerns a curse. A relative, the grandfather of the main character, descended into this hole, very much like the accounts of George Bradley. And there he met the spirit of Eldon Hole. So a bit like the physical aspect, the physical manifestation is the hole itself, but there is a kind of spirit or an essence that lives down there too. And this spirit tells him, I will protect you and your family and also the village of Peak Forest if you provide me with sacrifices. But if you neglect your duty, then I will send a plague over all of you, starting with your family, kind of pick you off one by one, and then it'll spread to the village. So I've concentrated on the most recent generation of the family, who in 1642 are Jane, William, and Mary. And they become the murderers who seek out the strangers who come to the village and they offer them to the hole. William, the brother, is quite mercenary himself, so he likes to take profit and rob these strangers too. So I'm going to read to you the first bit of this manuscript, just a little extract from chapter 1. And hopefully from that you'll see how I'm trying to bring together these ideas. So the brink. When a death so unnatural happens in our own yard, it means we've not offered her enough. It means she's hungry again. This time, it's not just one death, but four. Hence, the whole flock. My throat tightens as I edge towards the bodies that lie like heaps of fallen leaves. I should never have named them. Blinking away the rain, I nudge one, Pertalotter, I think, with the tip of my shoe. I hope to God that I'm wrong, that this is the work of a ravaging animal and nothing more. But not a single drop of blood speckles the feathers. Even in wet weather like this, I'd expect gore if a fox was the culprit. With a heavy dread in my belly, I look past the fields and the copse where the rooks slash the air, to the veil of cloud that shrouds the hilltop. Eldon Hole is hidden from sight, but I sense her craving. The other day, I fed her a sheep's skull. The wind had razored off all its flesh so that it gleamed in the dirt, and inside the hollow of its nose were thin walls of bone as delicate and puckered as an oat cake. After I threw it down her throat, sounds came bouncing off the steep walls. The clatter of bone against rock, the flapping of rooks, aye, but that's not all. There was another sound that sent me running down Eldon Hill without turning back. It came from the very bottom of that abyss. So sad it was, so lonely. If I close my eyes, I can still hear it now, the mournful dirge of a sheep bleating. It was a message, a warning, that animal skulls won't fill her up. Guilt twists in my chest. I should have known what had happened. I've been putting off giving her what she wants, so she's punished us. Next time, our crops will turn black and blue as if the devil has been pinching them. From there, it'll only get worse. Our cow will drop dead, and then a rot will spread across the whole village. Unless I do my duty. But I don't have room in my head to dwell on all that entails, not when animals lie dead at my feet, cunning poison pooled in their blood. I'll bury them out on the wastes, far away from where we eat and drink and sleep. I go in to fetch the spade. It's barely warmer inside the little house than it is out. The walls breathe damp and the rainwater is already turning some of the earthen floor to mud. This side of the house is the biggest mess, with Will's lead mining tools among the butter churns and firewood, his bed pushed up next to mine. What I'd do for one extra chamber where I could have some room to myself. I move the hatchet and sieve to one side, reaching for the spade at the back, and almost die of shock when I find Lordsmere lurking behind it. Come on, puss. I give my leg a tap, trying to convince him or me that all will be well and good. But when I put my hand out, the cat leaps away to the other side of the house and curls himself on Mary's chaff bed. Doubtless he can smell the evil on me. Once I've buried the hens, I'll give myself a proper scrub, though the thought of stripping bare in this freezing house makes me shudder. I'll make up a fire soon, get some heat into my bones. That's what I need, warmth and a wash. I breathe into my cupped hands a few times and rub them together, shushing the voice that insists death clings to my skin, and take the waxy covering off the spade. It's the same one we used to bury Mam's last bairn, a sister for me, Will and Mary, who came into the world before her time and left too soon, taking what was left of Mum's spirit with her. Heavy footsteps splash through the puddles outside. Some childish part of me, nestled under my ribs, leaps up and sings, Da's coming home, he's back! But those aren't Da's footfalls, for Da is lying in a churchyard at Chapel-on-le-Frith. The man of the house now is my brother, and the moment he finds out about the chickens, his rage will blast these walls to dust and splinters. Before I can prepare how best to deliver the bad news, in sweeps Will with the rain, cheeks aglow. I lean the spade against the wall and stand in front of it, steadying my breathing. You're back early, I say. I am. But I dropped in at the White Hart on the way. Mary has a message for us. What? His eyes glitter. You know what. 3 words crash down on my head, blurring my sight. The room wavers, then comes back as a picture that's too sharp, too real. Will peels off his cloak and the leather waistcoat beneath. I think he's a merchant. He's got a sack of goods with him, a great big sack. Mary heard he's on his way to Bolton. Solitary traveller, Janie. We're in luck. He shakes the rain off his hat, still circled by a scrappy ribbon of black crepe, and hangs it on the back of Da's chair. With his fringe slicked down, there's nothing to soften the planes and edges of his face. If someone stepped too close to him, they'd bleed. At last, I find my voice. Are you certain he doesn't have company? If he's not certain, there's a chance I can talk him and myself out of what we're about to do. Will tilts his head. You really think Mary would be telling me about him if he did? But he's expected in Bolton. Someone will be waiting for him. Nerves ferret around my insides as Will strides across the floor like he's always owned the place. He pours himself some ale from the jug on the table, and I watch his Adam's apple bob up and down with each thirsty gulp. 2, 3, 4. Then up he comes for air. He fixes me with his gaze. It's the darkest thing in the room, darker than the gap under the cupboard where the spiders breed. There'll always be someone waiting, Jaybird. The important thing is, no one's with him here tonight. But is he the right sort? You said yourself, we've got to. I know what I said. He wipes his mouth on the back of his sleeve. What's the matter with you? You better not be trying to get out of this. My throat's dry as if I've gulped down dirt. No. Then why do you look as though you're about to shit yourself? If I tell him, I know what'll happen next. He'll use it as a good reason, a very good reason, to go ahead with the plan. My soul will be forever marked. But how can I not tell him? I'd be putting the whole village in danger if I kept it to myself. So I'll stop there with the reading. Thank you for listening. If you want to find me, I'm not really available under my academic name, but you can find me under my author name. So as Sophia Adamovich is my pen name. So I'm on Blue Sky, Instagram, and alas X, although not really on there these days. My email address is there if you want to ask me any more questions, and I've got a newsletter for any writing news that is coming out, also a website. So these are my references if you want to read any more about Eldon Hole. And otherwise, thank you very much for listening.